Hello, and welcome to today's webinar, Standing Together Against Hate. This program is offered as part of the Canadian Race Relations Foundation's commemoration of International Holocaust Remembrance Day, which falls on January the 27th. My name is Len Rudner, and on behalf of the Race Relations Foundation, we're delighted to have you with us today. Before we begin, a few administrative details. We will follow our usual format for webinars. We will begin with the presentation of our guest, Gail Nathanson. At the end of the presentation, I will return to assist with the Q&A section of the program. As always, you may type your questions at any time during the presentation. My colleagues Jean-François Paget and Sharon Pan will group or combine similar questions together in order to make the best use of our time. As always, our webinars are provided for information and educational purposes only and do not constitute legal or professional advice. The opinions expressed by guests, panelists, and moderators are their own and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of the Canadian Race Relations Foundation. So, let's begin. On January 27, 1945, units of the Red Army liberated the Auschwitz concentration camp. In the years since, Auschwitz has become symbolic not only of the Holocaust, the murder of 6 million Jewish men, women, and children, but of the dangers of unchecked hatred and extremism. Since 2005, the United Nations has declared the day to be an occasion to remember not only the Jewish victims of the Nazi regime, but millions more who were considered by the Nazis to be inferior. But what have we learned since 1945? What challenges do we face as we confront online and real-world manifestations of anti-Semitism and other forms of hatred? And most important, what can we do to combat the spread of this destructive force? To answer these questions, it is my pleasure to introduce today's presenter, Gail Nathanson. Gail is the Associate Director, External Affairs at CIJA, the Center for Israel and Jewish Affairs. She's responsible for developing and supporting relationships with other faith-based and civil society groups and organizations who share common concerns with the Jewish community in Canada. Under Gail's guidance, CIJA has collaborated with partner communities on a range of issues, including combating online hate, fighting all forms of racism and discrimination, including anti-Semitism, supporting refugees fleeing persecution and genocide, and supporting Canadians with disabilities and their caregivers. Prior to joining CIJA, Gail was a special advisor to the Assistant Deputy Minister of the Ontario Office of International Relations and Protocol, and was previously the Vice Chair of the Ontario Office for Victims of Crime. Earlier in her career, Gail was a public affairs consultant and began her advocacy career in Washington, D.C., where she worked for the American Immigration Lawyers Association and the American Jewish Committee. Gail is a lawyer by training and practiced civil litigation at Goodman's LLP in Toronto. She's a graduate of McGill University and Osgoode Hall Law School. Gail, we're delighted to have you with us today, and please, the floor is now yours.
Thank you, Len. So first, let me say thank you to the Canadian Race Relations Foundation for taking this opportunity to talk about International Holocaust Remembrance Day and mark the day. As Len noted, it's important not only to remember the Holocaust, but also to reflect on lessons learned and to think about where we're at today in the fight against anti-Semitism and all forms of hatred. So I'll be addressing that a little bit in my presentation today. So welcome to all of you, and thank you for taking the time to join this webinar and to hear our thoughts on this issue, and I look forward to trying to answer any questions you have. So I'm going to talk a little bit today just briefly about what International Holocaust Remembrance Day is. I'm going to spend some time today talking about anti-Semitism today, what that looks like, and we'll talk a little bit about what we can do to fight anti-Semitism and all forms of hatred and discrimination. So first, just briefly, let me tell you a little bit about CIJA. As Len indicated, it's the Center for Israel and Jewish Affairs. CIJA is the advocacy agent for the Jewish Federations of Canada, representing the perspectives of about 150,000 Canadian Jews affiliated through their local federations. We build relationships with leaders in government, media, academia, civil society, and other faith and ethnic communities to ensure a greater understanding of the issues that impact the Jewish community, and by the same token, to ensure that the Jewish community has a greater understanding of issues impacting others. We work hard to combat anti-Semitism and discrimination in all its forms, and advocate for fundamental rights and freedoms, social justice, and support for the people of Israel. And Len told you who I am. I'm the Associate Director of External Affairs here at CIJA, and my primary role is to work with other communities and organizations to collaborate on issues of common concern to us all. So again, thank you for having us here today to speak. Let's briefly talk about International Holocaust Remembrance Day. As Len noted, in 2005, the UN General Assembly designated January 27th, which is Monday, as International Holocaust Remembrance Day. And that date marks the anniversary of the liberation in 1945 of Auschwitz, the largest Nazi concentration and death camp. This year is the 75th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz, and some of you may see or may be aware of a number of events that are going to be going on around the world this year to mark that very important anniversary. Now, at the risk of sounding simplistic or making assumptions, I just want to briefly talk about what the Holocaust is, what the term the Holocaust means. The term Holocaust, also known as the Shoah, refers specifically to the systematic murder by the Nazis of 6 million Jews between 1941 and 1945. 6 million Jews was 2/3 of the population, the Jewish population of Europe at the time. And every time I hear that, every time I hear that statistic, it really brings to the forefront what a massive it's an overwhelming number to even think about 2/3 of the community wiped out in that time. And I read the other day, and this is heartbreaking, that an estimated 90% of Europe's Jewish children were murdered in the Holocaust, an entire generation. As many of you will know, the murders were carried out in pogroms, which are violent riots, mass shootings, extermination through labor at concentration camps, gas chambers. Many of us are familiar with the horrific pictures and representations from that time. That's the term the Holocaust. It specifically refers to the murder of the 6 million Jews. But there's a broader term, the Holocaust era, which is sometimes described, began in 1933 when Hitler became the Chancellor of Germany. And as Len mentioned, targeted all those people and communities that they saw as inferior or undesirable. And this included the Roma, the Slavs, gay men, other political and religious dissidents, and the list goes on. These were all groups like the Jews that the Nazi regime saw and identified as other. And that's something that I think is important for us to keep in mind today as we talk about what anti-Semitism and other forms of discrimination look like in today's world. The other thing that's really important to remember is that when we talk about the Holocaust, we think about the murder of 6 million Jews, but we have to remember it didn't start with murder. Instead, Nazi persecution of the Jews started with the isolation of Jews from civil society, separating them out from their countrymen, with whom they had lived and worked and had friendships and marriages with and lived side by side up until that point. And the Nazis identified the Jews as other. They did that by boycotting Jewish businesses, prohibiting Jews from certain professions, forbidding Jews from marrying Germans, taking away their citizenship rights, forcing Jews to work in specific areas of their cities and the ghettos, essentially labeling, as I said before, the Jews as other and isolating them from the rest of society. As a result, International Holocaust Remembrance Day is an important opportunity not only to mark the Holocaust and honor those who were lost and those who survived as well, but also to think about what happened there, what lessons we learned, but also what's going on in the world today. And today we are seeing a real resurgence of anti-Semitism and all forms of hate, racism, and bigotry, I think in a way that we never thought we would. So that's why it's important to talk about International Holocaust Remembrance Day 75 years after the liberation of Auschwitz and keep those lessons learned alive. So, when we talk about anti-Semitism, Wikipedia defines anti-Semitism as hostility to, sorry about that, hostility to prejudice or discrimination against Jews. So the first question that I think we need to ask is, who are the Jews? Because Judaism is unique in a way. It's a religion, an ethnicity, and a culture. We like to say, or one way to think about it is, Jews are a people who have a religion. So there's a bit of a definition here. Jews or Jewish people are an ethno-religious group and a nation originating from the Israelites and Hebrews of historical Israel and Judah. Jewish ethnicity, nationhood, and religion are strongly interrelated, as Judaism is the ethnic religion of the Jewish people, while its observance varies from strict observance to complete non-observance, which is kind of a confusing concept. We're going to break it down a little bit. So first, let's talk about Judaism as a religion. I think that's how most people, particularly non-Jews, think about Judaism. But even when we're talking about Judaism as a religion, it's not quite so simple. So unlike many other religions, excuse me, give me 1 second. I need to X out of something on my screen that I thought I had X'd out of. Okay. Unlike many other religions, within the Jewish religion, there's a wide range of degrees and ways of observance. There's many different forms of Jewish religious expression. So here we've just got some pictures representing different degrees. Up here on the top left of the screen, you see the Hasidim, part of the ultra-Orthodox part of the religion, noted for their religious conservatism and social seclusion. Its members adhere closely both to Orthodox Jewish practice and the tradition of Eastern European Jews, which is indicated in their style of dress that goes back hundreds of years to the traditional dress in Poland. They use the Yiddish language, and you know, if those of you who live in the city of Toronto will have seen Hasidim walk around, very identifiable group. In the next picture, you see a little boy lighting the menorah for the Jewish holiday of Hanukkah in a more secular, sort of everyday dress that would be marked by many individuals in the Jewish community who would look more typically like this. The bottom left-hand side, you see women praying at the Western Wall in Jerusalem, the holiest place of prayer for Jews. And at the far right bottom, also the Western Wall, you'll see thousands of people praying at the site. So the point is that you can be Jewish and you can observe the Jewish religion in many, many different degrees. And this little boy and his family would identify with being Jewish as closely as the more Orthodox observant Jews. So let's talk about Jews as a people. When somebody says, I'm Jewish, it doesn't necessarily mean that they closely practice all traditions of the religion. It has a separate identity. There's a sense of being part of a people, a community, connected to other Jews, wherever they are from. So this is just a pictorial representation of Jews from across the world. We have Yemeni Jews here. We have Indian Jews. Here we have Ethiopian Jews. So again, often, you know, I'll speak my friends who aren't Jewish, when I explain to them I'm Jewish, but I'm not particularly observant, that doesn't always, it's not always a clear understanding for them, because I know in many other religions, identifying by your religion suggests that you are also closely following all the religious practices and attending places of worship on a weekly basis. In Judaism, that's not necessarily the case. Then we have the Israel, nation state of the Jewish people. And these statistics, 86% of Canadian Jews caring about Israel is either an essential and important part of being Jewish, 92% feel attached to Israel, even those who haven't visited there. And 79% of Jews have visited, Canadian Jews have visited Israel at least once. So an overwhelming majority of Jews feel a connection to Israel, whether they've been there or not. Israel is a core element of Jewish identity. Let's talk a little bit now that we know who is a Jew, and we can talk a little bit about what does anti-Semitism look like, because you'll remember earlier on I talked about the definition of anti-Semitism as hostility to, prejudice, or discrimination against Jews. So sometimes anti-Semitism is easy to spot. Many of us, you don't even have to follow the news that closely to know that there have been a number of violent, horrific anti-Semitic incidents around the world lately, just in the past 18 months. We had the murder of 11 people at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh in October 2018. We had an attack at a synagogue in Poway, California, over the Jewish holiday of Passover, exactly 6 months after the Pittsburgh attacks. In December of this past year, just a month ago, we had a violent attack at a rabbi's home in New York during the Jewish holiday of Hanukkah. And that's just 3 of the most highly visible and violent attacks that have happened in North America. There's been many other violent incidents in Europe and around the world, and there's certainly been a rise in violent anti-Semitic incidents lately. But there's also other less violent and less obvious forms of anti-Semitism that seem to be on the rise today. And not only in other countries, but in Canada as well. So take a look a little bit at some of the statistics around that. This is a statistic from Toronto Police Services about Toronto hate occurrences by group in 2018. This 42.4% is the hate crimes targeting Jews. And then you'll see subsequent smaller numbers. Muslim was 15.3%, LGBTQ groups the next largest, and then we've got women, Black Canadians, and other groups. So it is a truism that Jews are the most targeted group for hate crimes right now. And you can also see this statistic is from Stats Canada that just shows an upward trend in hate crimes against Jews since 2006 till 2017. Again, something I think that we would generally not expect to see, an upward trend, but it is unfortunately what we've been seeing. Also, we did a survey of Canadians called Attitudes Towards the Jewish Community a couple of years ago. And again, so this is, as the name of the survey suggests, was meant to evaluate broader Canadian attitudes towards Jews. So just quickly to go through it. So red is agree with the question, and the gray blue is disagree. So 21% of people answering the survey think that Jews talk too much about the Holocaust. 23% think that Jews have too much political power. 25% think that Jews have too much economic power. And 27% think that Jews have too much power in the media and entertainment. Just for a moment, I'll point out that I know the numbers don't add up to 100%, and that's because some people answered, I don't know, so they're not counted in the survey. So it's a minority of people who hold these attitudes, Canadians who hold these attitudes, but it's still a quarter, generally about a quarter of Canadians hold these attitudes, which are classic anti-Semitic attitudes that in the past have led to some of the horrible atrocities that we talked about. You remember when I said the Holocaust didn't start with murders, the Holocaust started with the Nazi regime isolating and describing and creating this otherness around Jews, and partly by taking away their businesses, taking away their professional licenses, with the implication that the Jews had too much political power or too much economic power. So it's very troubling to see some of these attitudes still exist in Canada today, currently. This is similar type, although slightly less concerning, I would guess, questions and also stats. 32% of Canadians think that Jews hold different values than the majority of Canadians. 34% think that Jews are more loyal to Israel than Canada, and that's something we're going to come back to talking about a little bit later. 47% think that Jews stick to themselves, and 48% think that Jews help other Jews more than they help other people. So again, these are not flattering or positive perceptions of Jews in Canada and feed into the overall rise in tenor of anti-Semitism. Now, this slide comes from a 2018 survey of Jews in Canada that was conducted by Environics in partnership with U of T and York Universities. So the previous slides were about Canadians' attitudes towards Jews and perception towards Jews. This slide shows Jewish individuals' responses to questions and what their personal experience around discrimination has been. So the question here was, tell me whether or not any of these things have happened to you in the past 12 months. One of the questions, because you are Jewish. So one of them was, were you called offensive names? 11% of Jews have been called an offensive name. And this, as I said, is in 2018. You can see the highest percentage, so this is the total, the 11, but the highest range was in 18 to 29-year-olds, and that relates to online hate and online attacks. And then 7% felt that they were snubbed in social settings because they were Jewish. So again, when you read these things, you think that in today's day and age, particularly in Canada and in our large cities, that this kind of anti-Semitism, it was long gone, and in fact, it's not. Being called a dirty Jew or some other kind of offensive name is still going on in Canada today. This is from the same Environics survey, which concluded that 41% of Jews in Toronto report consciously downplaying their Jewishness, which is higher than the national number. Now, and the national number is at 37%, which is also very high. And this is another real problem that stems from anti-Semitism, which is that Jews feel like they can't identify as Jews. I recently heard author and historian Deborah Lipstadt speak. Some of you may be familiar with her. She wrote a book last year called Anti-Semitism Here and Now. And she talks about this sort of suppression of Jewish identity, or what she would call Jews being forced back into the closet, as one of the most troubling elements of modern day anti-Semitism, that Jews don't feel safe identifying as Jews, and as a result suppress or hide their identity. She uses this expression that Jewish identity today is being defined by the oi, which is the oh my goodness, rather than the joy of the religion and the traditions. That Jews today often identify by their shared experience and fear of anti-Semitism rather than the richness of the religion and its traditions. And this is a point that I think is extremely troubling to many of us in the Jewish community, is that as horrible and terrifying as the violent forms of anti-Semitism are, and as horrible as the aggressive, as being a target of hate speech or online hate, the idea that as a result of that people's fear has caused them to hide their Jewishness or turn away from their Jewish identity or not want to identify as Jewishness is very troubling and has a real impact on the community as a whole. That's one of the reasons that we're so concerned today in the community about the rise in anti-Semitism. So at the beginning of my presentation, I talked about the definition of anti-Semitism as hostility to, prejudice, or discrimination against Jews. And I suggested that sometimes anti-Semitism is easy to spot and obvious, and sometimes it's a bit harder to put your finger on what is and what is not anti-Semitism. There is a tool that we at CEJA and others in our community and around the world are highly supportive of, which actually helps with identifying and defining anti-Semitism. It's the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, short form we call it IHRA, working definition of anti-Semitism. And it includes clear parameters for what does and does not constitute anti-Semitism. It's a non-legally binding definition that's been adopted by a number of governmental and non-governmental organizations worldwide. And as of December 2019, the definition had been adopted or recognized by 17 countries. Canada has adopted it as part of its recently released anti-racism strategy. The host of our call today, the Canadian Race Relations Foundation, is using the definition within their glossary of terms. The Canadian Human Rights Commission uses it, and so does the UN Special Rapporteur for Freedom of Religion and Belief. It's a very important definition. We're going to walk through it, but one of the things that is the most powerful about it is that it uses illustrative examples to help define and help people to understand what is and is not anti-Semitism. So let's walk through it a little bit. This is the preamble to the definition. Anti-Semitism is a certain perception of Jews which may be expressed as hatred towards Jews. Rhetorical and physical manifestations of anti-Semitism are directed towards Jewish or non-Jewish individuals and or their property, toward Jewish community institutions and religious facilities. So that's sort of a traditional definition. Here are some pictures of some obvious examples of anti-Semitism. You've got a swastika painted on the door of a synagogue. You've got a sign that says Hitler was right painted on the side of a highway. You have this picture here. This individual is a Holocaust survivor. This poster is for the UJA's campaign around Holocaust education, and somebody spray painted Achtung across it, which was a German slogan during Nazi Germany. It's watch out, but it's a slogan closely identified with Nazi Germany. I think that most people would look at these three examples and recognize those as anti-Semitism. But as we'll go on to see, not all examples of anti-Semitism are that clear. And so the IHRA definition continues on and says contemporary examples of anti-Semitism in public life, the media, schools, the workplace, and the religious sphere could, taking into account the overall context, which is very important, include, but are not limited to, the following examples. And here we start getting into some contemporary examples, and I'm going to briefly read them, or you'll have them on your screen as well, and then show you some examples of what that might look like. So calling for, aiding, or justifying the killing or harming of Jews is anti-Semitism. I think that, again, is something that might be quite obvious to people. Making mendacious, dehumanizing, demonizing, or stereotypical allegations about Jews as such, or the power of Jews as a collective, such as especially but not exclusively the myth about a world Jewish conspiracy or of Jews controlling the media, economy, government, or other societal institutions. We're going to see some examples of that, but you'll remember we talked about that's what happened in Nazi Germany, started with this isolation of the Jews and blaming them and alleging that they have too much power and too much money and control the government. And then we talked about that again subsequently when we saw some examples of Canadian attitudes towards Jews. So let's remember this one because we're going to see some other examples. And then accusing Jews as a people of being responsible for real or imagined wrongdoing committed by a single Jewish person or group, or even acts committed for non-Jews. So attributing to the Jewish community as a whole the act of one bad actor. Other examples are denying the Holocaust. That's what the first one is about. Or accusing the Jews as a people or Israel as a state as inventing or exaggerating the Holocaust. So I want to talk a little bit about dehumanization and conspiracy. This is a cartoon. The first time I saw it, I assumed it was from 1930s, late 1930s Germany. In fact, this cartoon was from the Facebook page of an Austrian vice chancellor that was up for 6 years and was only taken down in 2018. And it's a representation. This is the banker, this is the government, and this is the people. And you may be able to see that the banker is portrayed as quite gluttonous. He's feasting on a huge meal. The government is serving the banker and kowtowing to the banker. But what may be a bit hard to see on the screen, but is important to note, is that the banker has Jewish Stars of David as his cufflinks. He's got a large nose, which is often the stereotypical sort of trope of anti-Semitism. It's a representation that is meant to suggest that he's Jewish. And in the meantime, you have the malnourished, the people, this individual representing the people as a whole, who's being ignored by the government and has no food on his plate. This picture is very similar to depictions of Jews in Nazi propaganda, and yet, as I said, this was posted on the Facebook page of an Austrian vice chancellor until 2018, when he finally agreed to take it down. He had refused to take it down a number of times and had suggested that it was in no way anti-Semitic, which is very troubling. Next one, this statement: Jews rule this world by proxy. The Jews are not merely hook-nosed, but understand money instinctively. So here we've got the physical stereotype of Jews that are hook-nosed. We've got this idea of power and money. And this statement was made a year and a half ago by the Prime Minister of Malaysia. So this is the Prime Minister of a democratically elected country who's publicly making these kinds of statements. So you see these things and you read these things, and it really makes you shake your head that representatives of democratically elected governments around the world are making these kinds of statements publicly. And then you have stuff that's going on around the world that we're all more familiar with, because most of us would have seen this on the news. These are pictures from the Unite the Right white supremacist rally in Charlottesville, Virginia, not quite 2 years ago now. You'll notice the Nazi flags. You'll notice the Hail Hitler, salutes. Many of the audience participants were chanting the phrase, "Jews will not replace us." And what that means actually is that there is a conspiracy theory that there's a Jewish conspiracy to replace the whites, quote unquote, with others, with non-whites. So with the chant, "Jews will not replace us," was intended to mean that the Jews will not be successful in their conspiracy to replace the whites with others, whatever those others are, other minority groups. A number of undercover reporters were at these protests and reported that at the root of most of the groups, their primary concern was anti-Semitism. But you can see that anti-Semitism is always linked to other forms of racism. This is a picture of the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh, where the October 2018 attacks happened that killed 11 people. And the attacker was motivated by the belief that there was a Jewish conspiracy to bring in Latino and Muslim immigrants to take over. This synagogue had been involved in a lot of the resettlement efforts and refugee programs, and there was the individual who carried out these murderous acts was believed that there was a conspiracy theory to replace whites with others, and that this was all, the Jews were the cause of everybody's problems. So again, you can see anti-Semitism linked with all other forms of racism, hatred against anybody and everybody. The other thing is, in this instance, this is an example of where a lot of these, the individual responsible for these murders had been posting all of these theories online for a long time before he actually carried out the physical violence and killed 11 people. As I mentioned earlier, there's been a very clear correlation in the rise of online hate and offline real-world violence. Those past few examples were from outside of Canada, but we're not immune to this kind of anti-Semitic hatred and racist rhetoric in Canada. These pictures are from a publication that had been distributed in the beach area and the east end of the city of Toronto, called Your Word News. These newspapers were filled with these publications filled with anti-Semitic and misogynistic and racist rhetoric. The picture on the left here is again an example of a conspiracy theory where you have a Jewish business person controlling the government and controlling all the different political parties and the Bank of Canada governor and the Governor General. And here again, you have a representation, with a Nazi, like a Nazi representation. the publisher and editor of this publication were actually convicted of hate promotion against Jews and women. It's a criminal offense. They were both sentenced recently, which was the Crown took these allegations very, very seriously. This is an example of something that happened, I think it was 2 weeks ago. This individual was living in a halfway house type environment, an older gentleman with quite profound Alzheimer's, and somebody spray painted a swastika on his head and on his back. He's not clear who did it or how it happened, but this happened in the city of Toronto literally 2 weeks ago. And interestingly, this individual is not Jewish. So we talked before about the definition of anti-Semitism can include actions against or words against non-Jews. This individual was not Jewish, but this is clearly an anti-Semitic incident. So those previous examples, I think, were obvious examples of hatred towards Jews that we can wrap our heads around. But there's also a consensus among scholars that there's a new type of anti-Semitism that has emerged post-Holocaust in the form of hatred of Jews presented under the guise of hostility towards Israel and Zionism. So historically, anti-Semitism has adapted itself to social, political, intellectual trends and conditions. It's a very tricky creature that can manipulate and change to suit the circumstances and remain alive. So among some Christians in the Middle Ages, it took the form of charges of Jewish deicide. As nationalism grew in the 19th century Europe, anti-Semitism evolved into claims that Jews were a separate nation that threatened nation states in which they lived. And then in Nazi Germany, you had, the eugenics gaining traction and Jews being portrayed as racially inferior, as were other groups. Today, scholars widely acknowledge a new form of anti-Semitism in the form of hatred against Israel, which is the world's only Jewish state. So where Jews are once vilified as individuals and a collective, which still does go on today, sadly, today the Jewish state is often vilified, often using terminology and conspiracy theories that mirror historic anti-Semitism. So the quote on the left is from Martin Luther King Jr. in December 1969. When people criticize Zionists, they mean Jews. You're talking anti-Semitism. But it's a difficult thing to be able to identify legitimate criticism of the policies of the government of Israel to what is actually anti-Semitism disguised as anti-Israel rhetoric. And the IHRA definition is extremely helpful in this ways as well. And the IHRA definition says manifestations of anti-Semitism might include the targeting of the state of Israel conceived as a Jewish collectivity. However, criticism of Israel similar to that leveled against any other country cannot be regarded as anti-Semitic. So I think the definition is really helpful to us to not only, as I said, point out what is anti-Semitic, but what is not anti-Semitic. And legitimate criticism of Israel similar to that leveled against other countries is not anti-Semitic. Let's go on, because then, again, what's most useful about the IHRA definition are the illustrative examples that follow the definition portion. So examples: accusing Jewish citizens of being more loyal to Israel or to the alleged priorities of Jews worldwide than to the interests of their own nations can be anti-Semitic. And again, remember, it's all contextual. You have to look at the context in which these statements or gestures are made. Denying the Jewish people their right to self-determination, for example, by claiming that the existence of the state of Israel is a racist endeavor, can be anti-Semitic. And applying double standards by requiring of Israel behavior not expected or demanded by any other democratic nation can be anti-Semitic. The IHRA definition continues on with examples, using symbols and images associated with classic anti-Semitism, for example, the claims of Jews killing Jesus or blood libels, to characterize Israel or Israelis, drawing comparisons of contemporary Israeli policy to that of the Nazis, or holding Jews collectively responsible for actions of the state of Israel. All these things can be anti-Semitic. And we're going to see some examples. So here's some examples. This is, on the top left, you'll see a tweet by an individual who says, apparently liberal MPs Anthony Housefather and Michael Levitt, who are both Jewish, are more devoted to apartheid Israel than to their own prime minister and their own colleagues in the Liberal caucus. This is a comment he made following, I can't remember, it was a vote or whatever. And to what should be all of our relief, the leader of every political party came out and called out the individual for making these comments. So the prime minister said, vile anti-Semitic smears like this are completely unacceptable and should always be called out. Andrew Scheer said, it is shameful to see two MPs subjected to such anti-Semitism accused of dual loyalties simply because they're Jewish and support Israel. Jagmeet Singh, anti-Semitism has no place in Canada. I know what it's like to experience racism and discrimination and to have my loyalty to Canada questioned. And Elizabeth May, just saw the attack on you both. Your loyalty to Canada is unquestioned. So this goes back to what we said above in the one of the definitions. I'm just going to click back here. Accusing Jewish citizens of being more loyal to Israel or to the alleged priorities of Jews worldwide than to the interests of their own nations is exactly what was happening in that tweet. And as I said, something we should all be proud of is that each of the leaders of the parties stood up and called that out, which is something we're going to talk about a bit later. Here's just some other examples of anti-Semitism that would fall under the IHRA definition, as the IHRA definitions examples point out. Manifestations of anti-Semitism that might include targeting the state of Israel conceived of as a Jewish collectivity. You can see, Israel, your days are numbered. Israel must be destroyed for world peace. Jews are the terrorists. Mossad, which is the Israeli Secret Service, was responsible for 9/11. Zionists control Wall Street. Again, we're going back to that original thing we talked about, Jewish conspiracy. But instead of saying Jews control Wall Street, they've used the terminology Zionists control Wall Street. So you can see how criticism of Israel can actually be a disguised way, or what is being described or kind of disguised as criticism of Israel is actually, you could substitute the word Jews here, but they know that you can't say Jews control Wall Street because that's obviously anti-Semitic, so people find other ways of saying the same thing. This is an example that's actually quite upsetting and a good demonstration of holding Jews collectively responsible for actions of the state of Israel, which is one of the examples we gave. Leo Beck is a school, a Jewish school in Toronto for kids, I think, from JK to grade 8, so children. And it's hard to see on this slide because it doesn't come out so darkly, but somebody has spray painted Free Palestine on top of this sign for the Jewish day school. Now, this also goes back to the idea that you have to look at the context of which things are said. People could be out protesting Free Palestine. That is not anti-Semitic. When you spray paint it on the sign for a Jewish day school where children go to school, you're implying that the children in that school are responsible for the policies of the government of Israel. That is anti-Semitic. These children sitting in school have no responsibility for decisions made by the Israeli government. Just to wrap up, the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism concludes with this sort of summary of when is anti-Semitism criminal. So anti-Semitic acts are criminal when they are so defined by law, for example, denial of the Holocaust or distribution of anti-Semitic materials in some countries. Criminal acts are anti-Semitic when the targets of the attacks, whether they're people or property, are selected because they are or are perceived to be Jewish or linked to Jews. And this is where you can get into the idea of a crime becoming a hate crime that has implications for sentencing in particular and certain ways of prosecuting the crime. And then anti-Semitism could be discrimination if it's the denial to Jews of opportunities or services available to others, and is illegal in many countries. So that sort of wraps up what the definition is. So I've spent a lot of time talking about what anti-Semitism is, what it isn't, what Holocaust Remembrance Day is about. let's talk a little bit about what we can do to address the problem of anti-Semitism and hatred and discrimination in general. We think there's a few things. Obviously, the first thing is where there is a crime committed, people need to report it to the police. That's obvious. That's the first and most important thing to tell everybody. If there is something, a crime, whether it's an anti-Semitic incident or any other kind of race-based crime, hate-based crime, one should report it to the police. But, our goal is to really not get to that point and to be able to deal with anti-Semitism and other forms of hatred and discrimination before they ever get to the level of being crimes. So at CJO, we do a lot of work around education and outreach to lead to prevention. Participating in sessions just like this, and again, thank you to the Canadian Race Relations Foundation for hosting this webinar, because these are really important opportunities to talk about what does anti-Semitism look like, where, is something that you're experiencing or seeing is not anti-Semitic, what can you do about it? It's really important to teach people. We do a lot of work in schools. We do work with universities. We do work with police forces. We train others around what is and is not anti-Semitism to help give people tools to deal with these situations. And so again, prevention is about education and outreach, and we do as much of that as we can. The other thing is exposure and isolation. So if something is criminal, you can report it to the police, and then the police will deal with it. But sometimes things aren't criminal; they're just offensive, and we want to put an end to it. So we talk about banishing something rather than banning it, or naming and shaming behavior. That's calling people out. That's like what the leaders of all the political parties did to that individual when he made the allegation that that the Jewish MPs were more loyal to Israel than to Canada. They all called him out, and they shamed him for taking that position. They did it in a very public way. We tell people, when you see anti-Semitism or you hear anti-Semitism or any form of hatred, racism, discrimination, it is our responsibility as people, as individuals, to call it out. And that's equally true. Deborah Lipstadt, who I referred to earlier, talks about being at a family dinner, and Uncle Joe is coming to dinner, and everybody knows that Uncle Joe often is a little bit controversial in his comments, but Uncle Joe is old and set in his ways, and he doesn't really mean any harm. And Mom says to you, please don't fuss when Uncle Joe comes for dinner, and starts to make those comments about other people. And Deborah Lipstadt will say, of course you have to call out Uncle Joe for his anti-Semitic or anti-Black racist or misogynistic or whatever his statements are. You have to call out Uncle Joe, because if you don't call out Uncle Joe, who's going to call out Uncle Joe? If his own family doesn't do it, nobody's going to do it. So we all bear the responsibility in our day-to-day lives of calling out examples of anti-Semitism or any form of racism or discrimination that we see, and we bear the responsibility of teaching our children that same thing. And I think it sometimes sounds a little Pollyannish, but I really do believe that is how we change views, and we put things back in the closet, not people's willingness to identify as Judaism, but people's willingness to come out and make anti-Semitic, racist, or other types of discriminatory comments because they think it's okay. And if we don't call it out, people feel empowered to say it. And, to touch on the connection between anti-Semitism and other forms of racism and online hate, in today's world, it's really, really easy to make horrific, offensive comments online under the protection of anonymity. And I think that has clearly led to an environment where people feel more empowered to make these statements and to say these things. And we've seen that these online behaviors, as I said, can lead to real world violence. So I think given that feeling of that pervasiveness of almost permissiveness for people to be publicly and out loud saying things that I would never have thought people would feel comfortable saying anymore, and now people feel empowered to do it. Those of us who feel passionately and strongly that these comments and these racist attitudes, anti-Semitic attitudes are inappropriate, need to be just as bold in calling out the behavior of others. So I'm gonna end it there. we have a little slide here about how you can reach CJA if you have any more questions. But I think I will stop talking now and see if there's any questions from the rest of you. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Gail. So I will remind folks that if you have questions, please do type them into the dialogue window on your screen. We will see them here, right? And we will pass them on. We will pass them on to Gail. Okay. But while we're waiting, Gail, a couple of questions occurred to Jean-François and myself. Okay. So history is an interesting thing. And the Holocaust certainly took place within the living memory of survivors, but given all the other terrible things that have happened in the world since, why is it still important to talk about the Holocaust today? What, in your opinion, explains its special relevance?
That's a very good question, Len. So we struggle with this within the Jewish community. To Len, to your point, as you know, there's very few survivors left today to even tell their stories. And it's 75 years now since the liberation of Auschwitz, and we ask ourselves, why is it still relevant? And many of us know the expression from that era of never again. We were supposed to have learned from the Holocaust, and as a worldwide community, we were supposed to make sure that never happened again. And yet, Len, as you pointed out, there have been a number of genocides, like officially recognized genocides since that time, and certainly other mass crimes against humanity. And I think it's important to keep talking about it, because what's the alternative? I mean, it is the sort of the most profound example of the mass murder of a group of people simply because of their identity. And if we don't remind people about that, even though we continue to see things happen around the world, if we don't remind people about that and we don't talk about how it is still going on in the world today, I can only imagine that it can only be worse. We have a duty to teach our children and our children's children that these atrocities happen. And 75 years ago is not that long ago. And it's really important to keep those conversations going and to remind people that it happened then, and it happens today in various parts of the world. I think the other thing that's really important about it is what I referred to at the beginning. It didn't start with the rounding up and murdering of people. It started with isolation of people. It started with scapegoating of a particular community and communities. And we see that happening in our day-to-day lives. And like I was just saying, and that's where we need to call that out at an individual level and at a local community level, whether it's an atrocity being carried out by a government or offensive, troubling actions and language carried out by individuals. We need to remember, as we said, Len and I worked together on some commemoration ceremonies around Genocide Remembrance Day, and we had a slogan that it starts with words. So much of this hatred starts with words, and we need to use our words as we teach our children. We need to use our words to call it out and put an end to it.
Great, thank you very much for that, Gail. So you actually mentioned the project that we worked on earlier on genocide awareness, which leads, I suppose, to the question of partnership or allyship, if you will. So what can other communities do to help in the fight against anti-Semitism? I suppose, the matching question is, what is CRRF doing to build alliances with other communities? And at a time when everybody seems to be withdrawing, why should anybody care about the problems that someone else is having?
So, excellent question, Len. So, look, we always say that something that starts with, it may start with anti-Semitism, but it's not going to end with anti-Semitism. And I always forget the actual quote, but there's the reference to it's, first they came and took whoever, and then they came and took, but I was not that person, so I didn't worry about it, and it goes down the line. When one community is targeted, it's never just about that community. So even if we don't have it in our hearts and our souls to care about other human beings because we care about humanity, we should always worry that when one group is targeted, even from a very selfish perspective, if one group is targeted, you know, any group can be the next target. So we really need to have that. I don't like to describe it that way because I prefer to think that we all care about other people in the world. But I think it is important to remember that it never ends with one group. It just goes on and on and on. And to that point, Len, I think that it is really important for all of us. So CJ engages with a wide range of other communities, as I said, who have joined us in the fight against anti-Semitism, not only because they believe that anti-Semitism in and of itself is hateful and needs to be fought, but also because they recognize that all forms of hatred against all forms of people is despicable, and we all need to be working together. By the same token, we stand by other communities in their fight against discrimination and various forms of discrimination and racism. And some examples of some of the things we're doing right now, we've been working very closely with a wide range of communities, specifically on a strategy and efforts to encourage the Canadian government to come up with a strategy to combat online hate, because as we talked about earlier, I think that the online forum is the festering ground for so much of what's going on in the world now, and there are various ways that needs to be addressed, whether it's considering additional ways to cause social media and internet companies to be more thoughtful about what they allow traveling across their channels, to better education on internet savviness and awareness to our youth, to empowering people to understand what is and isn't anti-Semitism, discrimination, racism, and be able to give them tools to call it out, to ensuring that teachers in our classroom can identify those forms of discrimination and are equipped to deal with it. So we are working with a broad range of groups right now on that issue in particular. We are going to be sending letters to key ministers, and we're going to continue to advocate for legislative and policy changes on that issue. And I would say that we're working with we've got close to 40 different groups from different communities who are working with us on that issue. What I have found so heartening about it is that, you know, everybody sees that this is a problem, and people are energized to work together from all communities, from all different walks of life. Some organizations and communities that wouldn't necessarily agree on certain other things, but who collectively understand the need and the urgency of addressing this issue, as we all watch the news day after day, and day after day see horrible things going on against specifically targeted minority, vulnerable communities. And so we'll work on this particular project. We're working with other faith-based groups, other ethnic organizations, women's groups, LGBTQ+ groups, all range of organizations and communities who are directly impacted, but also want to stand by and stand with communities that are vulnerable and targeted, even if they represent a community that is less vulnerable.
Wow. Okay. Well, thank you. Thank you very much for that, Gail, not only as a moderator, but also as a member of the community. But, you know, the interesting question, I suppose, is this, or one interesting question anyway. In a sense, you know, well, on the one hand, we cannot ignore that things seem to be, you know, worse now than they were, let's say, 10 years ago. But on the other hand, it's difficult perhaps to point out at something that has changed. The online environment has been a problem since its creation practically. So what in your opinion explains what appears to be a resurgence of anti-Semitism in the public square and elsewhere? You know, and I suppose more broadly, are we also seeing a resurgence of more broad-based intolerance, not only towards Jews, but towards Muslims, you know, persons of color, and so forth?
Yeah, I think yes. You know, you will hear lots of people talk. I mean, look, you look at the world around us today and the increasing number of countries where whatever term you want to use, nationalist, isolationist, whatever term you want to use, parties are taking power. There's clearly some feeling going on in places of individuals feeling vulnerable or disempowered, people who used to feel confident and secure. There is certainly rhetoric being used broadly by leaders of country around the world that I think are empowering some of these groups to feel like they need to keep out, quote unquote, the other, whoever that other might be in their mind or is identified by their leaders. And all that, you wonder whether there's actually a rise sort of on an individual level of people's racist, anti-Semitic attitudes, or whether, as I said, there is just now, number one, an emboldening of people who feel justified in publicly saying those things because world leaders are doing it. And they now have the tools to find like-minded people really easily from around the world through the internet, which would have been, much more difficult to do 10 or 15 years ago, which allows them to feel part of a group and even more empowered and emboldened. I always used to say, everybody, people have their ways of thinking, and we don't know how people develop some of the attitudes that they have. But I always thought that, people think what they think in their head. What scares me is when they feel like it's okay to say it when they're standing on a crowded elevator. Once people feel like they don't need to filter their racist or anti-Semitic comments, and they can say it out loud in a public place where they don't know the other people around them and they don't know if those people are like-minded to them, to me that means it's become normalized. And to me that's a big leap from what you think in your head, but no, you're not supposed to say it out loud, versus feeling like it's okay to say it out loud. And I think what we're seeing now is that kind of shift on a global scale. As I said, people are feeling empowered by people on the, political and other leaders on the world stage making similar comments, and also by their ability to find like-minded souls through the internet.
Yeah, I'm reminded that many years ago, I cannot remember her name, but she was the wife of Conrad Black. She commented, and this probably would have been in the early 2000s, about a dinner party that she attended, where she reported that a rather senior diplomat, commenting on the state of Israel, said, "Isn't it wonderful that we can finally say what we want about that bleep little country?"
Right.
And it was this sense of, oh, what a relief to be able to kind of let all the bile out.
Right.
Yeah. Also, I recall that I think it was Deborah Lipstadt who said fairly recently that once upon a time we talked about lone wolves, but because of the internet, there really are no lone wolves anymore. There is simply this large international community of like-minded and dark-thinking individuals.
Exactly.
So one last question for you, Gail. So, given that anti-Semitic incidents are a reality, and given that the Jewish community, right, is targeted often, and in many cases, in many cities, the most often, what resources are available to those who have experienced these incidences and perhaps are feeling traumatized by them as a result?
It's a really good question, Len. So the first thing, as I said, I would say is if somebody experiences a situation or an incident that may be criminal, they should call the police. And we're lucky, particularly in Toronto, but in other communities as well, we have hate crimes units specifically dedicated not only to anti-Semitism, but to similar, to all hate crimes, with incredibly well-trained officers who understand the nuances of the crime, but also the nuances of what it's like to be a victim of that. I also know that victim services organizations will provide support and services to people who have been victims of hate crimes. And it's funny because I just asked somebody about this recently from my old Office for Victims of Crime, whether those services extend to people who have been victims of online hate. which may or may not cross the threshold of a criminal act. I mean, one could also say that about a live incidence of anti-Semitism that may not sort of meet the threshold of a crime. But I would also say that anybody who has experienced an incident of anti-Semitism can reach out to CJA, can let us know about it, and we can help connect people to resources, or we can help if we think there is an issue that needs to be raised up to the level of police or other kinds of authorities, we can assist with that. And even if it's from another community, we are, as I said, very well connected with other communities and can help put people in touch with other organizations that might be able to provide support and services.
Excellent. That's very helpful, Gail. Thank you. And so at this point, I'd like to more formally, Gail, thank you for taking the time to share your expertise and your experiences with us. I'd also like to thank folks who took time out of their day to join us on this webinar. There are other webinars scheduled. I believe in, one second, my friend is about to pull it up for me. All right, while he's doing that, I'm going to say on February the 6th, we will be featuring David McDonald, who will be calling in from New Zealand to talk about the genocide against Indigenous people in Canada. And there is another webinar which will be coming up on March the, is it March the 6th as well? Okay, and that will be featuring Gina Valley, who will be speaking about building inclusive organizations. Okay. As always, all of the webinars are produced by the Canadian Race Relations Foundation can be found on our website. We record them, and you can seek them out and listen to them again for your own listening pleasure. So Gail, once again, thank you so much, and everybody have a wonderful and safe day. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
Bye-bye.
Bye.